Our main story tonight is about the errors with John Oliver and Last Week Tonight. Errors that are rather egregious considering the scope of resources, staffing, relative fame and influence, and claimed high standards of John Oliver and the show Last Week Tonight. Do note, before we get too far into this, that any frequently asked questions will be answered in a tagged or sticky post at the top of the replies, so please check that before commenting, as you may already have an answer to your question. This video may seem like an attempt at clout chasing, unwarranted criticism, or simply shouting an opinion into the void with about as much significance as a fart in the wind. While all of these things are arguably true, it is more that we have watched a number of segments from this show over the years. Sometimes they seem mostly reasonable, other times they are obviously erroneous. Between these two extremes, there is a vast chasm made up of grey content. Content that isn't absolutely wrong, but also not right. It is to the completely wrong end and mostly grey area that we have an issue. As noted already, the entire program is well resourced. While we are forced to speculate to the exact amounts HBO puts into the program, we can establish as one of the more significant shows HBO carries. It isn't exactly Game of Thrones level of funding, but a broad estimate places each episode at between $1 and $3 million per an episode. This may or may not include substantial artistic, novel, or otherwise extravagant stunt spending, so bear in mind that it may be more than this, or it may be at the lower end of this. At the lower end, let's say it's between $1 and $2 million. This is just under half the estimate at $1.5 million. That is a lot of money for which to make a mistake, and so we hold the program to a much higher level than, say, Joe Bloggs, who writes on model trains.
I like trains.
That is, unless they also present themselves as either an expert or relying on expert knowledge, in which case, again, we would hold them to a similar level, just not millions of dollars of level of expectation. Money alone is one issue, but more than just being able to slap the staff with wads of cash until they spit out a script, the show does have staff. Not interns in all cases, but staff who have had to research, write, correspond with parties and more. Many people who not just need to have a working knowledge of the topic, but ability to recognize errors, and, as we will discuss, fail to do so. The final issue is the coverage and projection of being not just factual, but very much widely influential as a source of information, the John Oliver effect. Information that in some cases is very much wrong, an error that may go unnoticed with the structure of each episode and the way it is projected to be a, let's say, factual report that deters people from questioning the content, especially with the relative pace of some of the episodes. If Oliver says, "My staff found," you probably don't stop to think, what does he mean staff? And did one guy, or gal, Google this while on the John? Haha. Or was it actually a group effort of some sort, where the findings have been collaborative made and cross-checked? At times we think it is the former, with anti-vaxxer levels of toilet Google research underpinning the whole section. So far, this might sound like some rather grandiose or even arrogant claims. Who are we to call out such a program? Surely if they got this wrong, they would be sued or held accountable by some sort of, let's say, broadcast authority, or even HBO. Well, possibly, but it's less likely, given the wide swath of protections that they have for even minor or major mistakes. This owes largely to America's First Amendment and the ability to say just about anything you want, and be able to get away with it in many cases. Not all cases, mind you, but many. This is one reason why we also hold Oliver to a much higher standard.
With great power comes great responsibility.
Oliver has repeatedly stated that Last Week Tonight is not journalism but comedy, and emphasizes that factual accuracy serves the pursuit of humor. And, as was quoted in NPR in 2016, "You can't be wrong about something, otherwise that joke just disintegrates."
And I really don't want to be a fact-checky bitch about this, but the thing is...
This should suggest a commitment to accuracy, but it also means that the comedic lens can be somewhat selective in its framing, which isn't a problem in itself, but John Oliver himself in the show states repeatedly throughout multiple episodes that he intends to pursue factual reporting, and the problem we have is it's simply not what happens in some cases. To use a simple comparison, Adam ruins everything that gets things wrong too, the difference being that their errors are based in actual failures to do proper research or a misunderstanding. They also don't have millions of dollars to play with in each episode they produce, anywhere near as large a staff, or with the same influence or prestige as Oliver and his show. We still have the same standards, but their errors are at least something that can be understood as a failure based on capacity, not a failure simply by failing. This is likely why, say, Ad Fontes Media gives the show a ranking of 26.78 regarding reliability. Note that a ranking of 24 or less is considered problematic. They sit just above that line. It is also similarly, let's say, problematic in how it's biased, with a rating of negative 17.89 out of a rating between negative 42 and 42. So there's a definite bias there towards the more liberal side of things. Which, again, this wouldn't be a problem if it was something that didn't ultimately affect the reporting, but it appears to do so. Let's start with what is an undeniable example, and it's a simple example that really does demonstrate the underlying problem. There's an episode from 2024 called Biofuels and Ethanol. In this section, or episode let's call it, Oliver criticizes the environmental impact of corn-based biofuels, suggesting they have a significant carbon footprint and they have minimal climate benefits. Okay, this sounds like a reasonable premise to start from, but the problem is simply that the data that is being used is either outdated, debunked as a myth, or is just an assertion that isn't necessarily accurate. Now, some of the research they try and talk about is possibly true, but the underlying core premise is all about land utilization, that is the acreage for corn, and corn acreage utilization hasn't increased since 1930. This means that the actual amount of corn we're getting, and the fact we can use it for a vast number more things than just, say, feed or human consumption, but transition into, say, using it for biofuels, means we're not using any more land, we're just getting more out of it. This is a very simple but poignant example. A simple point: land use did not change, but production of fuel increased. In other words, land use for corn has been stable for over 90 years, but Oliver blamed biofuel production for the amount of corn being grown. This completely ignores the fact that biofuels weren't even remotely a significant factor in corn land utilization before the late 70s to 80s, as a result of issues with OPEC and fossil fuel production. That was at least 40 years after land utilization rates had already mostly become static. So, unless somehow or other he believes that the people responsible for choosing to produce more corn for biofuel are time travelers, which would be an interesting premise, it's not possible that they had set this much land for corn and decided it would be needed in 40 years' time. To test if this was just a singular issue, we chose to look at the last 5 seasons. And note we are talking full seasons, so the current year has not yet completed, and we didn't include that. From this, to ensure continuity of work, we only looked at episode 7, 14, and 21 each season. This is only, admittedly, 1 in 8 to 1 in 10 episodes from each season, but time constraints mean we need to be pragmatic and rationalize this to identifying only a small sample of errors. Also, nobody's going to watch a 10-hour-long video where we review every episode, go through every error, and explain why that is, even if we can make it as short as that. So bear in mind that episodes 7, 14, and 21 from seasons 7 through 11 are addressed here. Season 12 has not been touched because it's not yet complete, and prior to season 7 we haven't looked at either. Let's start with the oldest of content, as this has the longest time to be corrected. Failures being recognized and something stated, but no. In fact, this is how we'll deal with basically every section, so just bear in mind with season 7, we're going to follow the same pattern here. Each episode will be addressed, but with in the wider context, let's say. So season 7, episode 7, has no glaring errors that we can find in and of itself. We do have some concerns that Oliver may have glossed over a degree of bias in the Democratic press briefings and how they selected more lenient, or perhaps better to say less critical outlets. But this is less an error and more of a framing problem which we want to raise now, as it is going to apply to just about every other episode that we mention. That is to say that there is a consistent and definite problem with every episode reviewed, in that the framing can often be not just biased, which Oliver frequently openly admits, but also overgeneralizing in doing so. It's also noteworthy to point out that in some episodes we will raise issues with, such as this episode on the One American Network, the lack of specific examples that are cited and the depth to which this is gone, which is honestly very shallow. It's not possible to specifically call out any issues, as it's so general that it's hard to identify what is and isn't true. So again, bear this in mind, as some of these issues will come up again and again throughout various episodes. As we go, you should also find timestamps on the bottom of the screen here telling you where we're referring to in the currently available YouTube videos. This will invariably bring us to the next example with Season 7, Episode 14, and this is definitely more egregious.
show is actually going to be about one thing, and you probably know what, and you probably know why. Because all week long, protesters have continued to fill the streets in all 50 states in the wake of the horrific murder of George Floyd by the police. And in response to those protests, which have been a stirring pushback against institutional racism and brutality, it's been frankly sickening to see them met with this.
Across the country, peaceful protests have too often devolved into standoffs with heavily armed police using military-style tactics. Flashbangs, tear gas, rubber bullets, helicopters, armored vehicles.
We're out here peacefully protesting, but they're armed like they're going to war.
Yeah, they are. And look, if police are trying to convince the public they're not guilty of displaying excessive force, it's probably not a good idea to repeatedly display excessive force on national television, including in this city, where Mayor de Blasio praised them for their tremendous restraint, and Governor Cuomo threatened to send in the National Guard. And I'll say this.
While we admit that law enforcement has been increasingly militarized, this is neither new nor, very importantly, is it unreasonable in all cases. The police are being asked to deal with more, not just violent, but militarized criminals or situations that warrant practically military levels of action, if not just protection. Arguably, you can make a case not for offensive gear, but it is happening with increasing frequency that would be of benefit to police in trying to not only defend themselves, but address whatever they have to deal with. This is why, ironically, talking about the Bearcat is a gross failure. The Bearcat is actually made specifically for law enforcement and paramilitary use, paramilitary in this case basically being SWAT teams. It was later adopted by military forces, and for a very good reason. They were operating in urban areas where military vehicles, say the Abrams, and similar, where you have a tank or the armoured personnel carrier and infantry fighting vehicles such as the Bradley, weren't really suitable. Something like the Bearcat was. So what happened is there was a civilian-use vehicle. The military looked at that and thought, you know what, that's a great idea, much like say the Willys Jeep, and decided to use it in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. That does mean Oliver has the sequence of events arse backwards. The military took a civilian vehicle and used it. Not the police are using a military vehicle. They bought it second-hand from them, yes, but that's not the point. Other than that, it's rather more important to say, as Oliver should be well aware, there are times and places where it is needed or used. From an Englishman, it is rather hypocritical to complain about armoured vehicle use and police violence. Consider the Irish Troubles. Black and tan bastard? Even when we look at America alone, the use of armoured cars and APCs by police long predates the supposed militarization of police. This hypocrisy is on full display in Season 8, Episode 14, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. Finally, defund the police, as it is taken to actually mean, that is in all context by any organization that uses the term, by any application in terms of actual policies put into effect or anything else, is take money from one organization, the police, and put it somewhere else. That is, effectively, the other side being funded. The fact that funds are reallocated does not detract from that point. You are still defunding one organization to give that money to another. Oliver makes effectively the same argument that we are in regards to lotteries and fundraising in schools, so no. If it's not true of what they're doing with lotteries and how they use money from that in other states, it's also not true here. But let's say that there is actually a basis for this. The answer is still no, as it has been tested in New York. The movement of approximately $1 billion led to an increase in crime. Let's be clear about this. Defunding the police did exactly what was expected. Crime increased. 2020, homicides rose to 468. In 2019, they were 319. This is an increase of about 140, or roughly a 33% increase in 1 year. The trial of this idea does not work as described. We hope the response is not something but this isn't real to fund the police because fuck that bullshit. No true Scotsman fallacy crap. They've done exactly what is described. Taken money by defunding the police in the form of $1 billion, put it into other things, and it didn't work. As an aside, we do need to add this postscript note that occurred while we were editing the video. It appears that Oliver's claim that Trump had protesters outside Lafayette Church removed by police for a photo opportunity.
Then his Attorney General had police gas protesters outside the White House so that Trump could have an inexplicable photo op at a nearby church while holding up a Bible like it's the ticket for his sandwich order that was just called.
May not be completely accurate. Now, whether or not this is a factual error will rather depend on three things: your political affiliation, how much power you believe Trump actually has, and, somewhat importantly, whether or not you actually believe in coincidences. If you take these things, it would appear that all actions regarding the removal of protesters were made hours before Trump was even expected to show up there, and nobody knew that he was going to show up there until after the decision had been made and was being enacted. The decision appears to be in relationship to actions by the protesters and their violence, not Trump, and that the people making the decision have no direct relationship with Trump, and a few other things. Notably that an investigation after the fact by the Inspector General found that no, Trump did not provide the instructions. Now this is where the political affiliation, the coincidence thing, and confidence in government reports comes into play. Whether or not you believe that, the report by the Inspector General is to be believed, whether or not you believe that Trump still managed to influence people without telling them that he wanted something done, and of course, finally, whether or not you think that all of the various events, such as a decision hours before anyone knew Trump would be there to move protesters on due to violence, was a great big coincidence, or if it was all part of some wider excuse that a whole bunch of disparate and distinct different groups have managed to put together to somehow justify what happened. But this is just something we picked up while doing the editing after the fact, so bear in mind that this should have been in the original video as it is.
Nearly half of non-union workers say they would like to be in a union, and a lot of workplaces do seem like a natural fit for one. It's a lot more complicated than that, because if you have never been through a union organising drive yourself, you might assume that a union vote is a completely free and fair election. That is an illusion fed by executives like Jeff Bezos.
The last episode for Season 7 is obviously episode 21 on jury selection and juries as a whole.
Moving on. Our main story tonight concerns jury duty.
While we can't quite place single problems or fallacies in accuracy and so on, there are again some fairly major flaws in what Oliver says that we do need to point out because this is rather important. The race-based preemptory strikes have been curtailed by the courts, and Oliver even makes this clear when he brings up the same case law. And it's on the court system to make sure that the complexity of jury selection and the various mechanisms available are used appropriately and performed appropriately. This is also necessary in many cases for an attorney to balance things like juror impartiality and sometimes for strategic case goals. In short, stating that this is exclusionary but offering no better option is rather foolhardy, mostly because all the errors that were mentioned are known about because they were discovered and fixed. The other side to this, of course, is also that where we have, say, prosecutors trying to get rid of jurors, we have the defense attorneys using these same powers the other way round. But there's no reference to defense counsel who holds the same powers using them with anywhere near, if at all, the same kind of, let's say, vitriol that he appears to apply to prosecution. Shifting now to Season 8, where Oliver and his staff should have a year to improve, we get to Season 8, Episode 7, that talks about the national debt.
Moving on. Our main story tonight concerns the national debt, the world's most boring $28 trillion.
This is not the first time a country has been in a similar situation. Again, Oliver should know this. The UK went into debt over the Napoleonic Wars to the tune of £831 to £832 million at the time, and this is an astronomical sum for the time, more than 200% of the UK's GDP when the war was ended. This required more than 2/5, 40%, more than 40%, of government revenue just to service the interest, let alone paying down the principal. Only in 1914 did the UK lower the debt to just 30% of GDP. Now, to be clear about this, it took over 100 years to be able to get enough increase in GDP that now the debt was only 30%. And only on the 5th of July 2015 did the last of the bonds associated with this debt get cleared. It cost a total $2.6 billion, that's billion with a B, to pay this off. Should be very clear about this. The ability to service this debt was not possible because they could keep paying it alone. Remembering, they were paying more than 40% of the GDP against just the interest. But because technological shifts of the time and through to the present day drastically increased productivity and therefore government revenue or GDP, allowing it to make up a significantly smaller proportion of what money was coming through. So if the debt were not present, that would have been £2.8 billion that could have been spent productively in many respects over approximately 200 years. So yes, it does actually have an effect, and not an insignificant effect on provision of services, or at least the ability to fund services. For example, the police and whatever other public health or public support services you're interested in. Next is episode 14 with the model minority myth.
Moving on, our main story tonight concerns Asian Americans, a group that currently makes up around 7% of the US population and is actually the fastest growing racial group. And yet despite that, Asian Americans can sometimes be oddly overlooked.
This is another example of not an explicit failure, but an inconsistency if not hypocrisy by Oliver in his videos. This is the same Oliver who lumps white people all together. It is hypocrisy. Let's apply this to, say, BIPOC and similar. BIPOC being biracial, indigenous, and people of colour. These are very discrete and different groups, and yet they've just been lumped together. Asian Americans, obviously, and as we pointed out, white people. But what about, say, Hispanics or South Americans? What about just simply Africans? White people could be anything, as with all these other groups. It's not exactly, let's say, a reliable indicator of what we're going into. This is an act all the more egregious for the British actions in Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. It is almost ironic that Cromwell's views were and are still so deeply ingrained into American society and culture, with quotes like "rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God" being paraphrased or used outright, and the very deliberate obfuscation of the Irish question and the earlier Irish problem as the English described it. We bring up one more point before we jump into the depths of that. Oliver makes a particular issue of suicide being the leading cause of death for Asian Americans between 15 and 24. It is the leading cause of death for all Americans between 15 and 24. Asian Americans don't really factor into this. They die at pretty much the same issue here. You don't have Asian Americans, because you're in the age bracket, are high risk. No, if you're in that age bracket, you're at risk regardless. But we want to touch on the racial hypocrisy issue, because it runs deep. The English sent hundreds of thousands of Irish off to the New World as slaves. White people who are effectively citizens, admittedly unwilling citizens, of the UK, were shipped off to the New World to work the sugar plantations as slaves. Yeah, and Oliver makes this long-running speech regularly about the effect of historical grievances on various people and groups. Perhaps shut up. Or please at least recognise that Cromwell did a lot of deeds that need to be discussed before you have any ability to dig into that territory again. And certainly about at least, if not one, both of the major genocides he conducted: the mass slaving, the seizing of land, the removal of all titles, names, families broken up, the introduction of a completely novel church, the list goes on.
As well as what I think we can all agree is the world's most fuckable bee.
Next we go on to something that's rather more light-hearted at least. That's not a bee. It has one pair of wings, not two, no obvious pollen baskets, the coloration is wrong, the mouth parts are wrong, and the body lacks hair. Given Oliver's penchant for pedantic comments, this seems especially apt. And this was something he admitted to in 2019, or 3 years before this episode aired, and appears to have continued after this episode aired, so pedantic identification of bees should be something he gets right. Last is episode 21. Here we have issues with what can only be described as an outright error, but not a factual error.
Specifically though, I want to talk about one of the more damaging things the internet has enabled, and that is ransomware attacks. Basically, incidents where hackers get into a computer, lock up the data, and then force the owners to pay a ransom in order to unlock it. You may have heard a lot about them recently. And the thing is, hackers don't necessarily have to work too hard to do this. About 85% of hospitals don't have a single qualified cybersecurity person on staff, which does feel like it's just asking for trouble. In fact, lax security is a problem across all industries.
Having a qualified cybersecurity staff member does not and will not stop someone giving access, whether intentionally or unintentionally, as is aptly demonstrated in a moment. In all efforts, there will inevitably be somebody who has the bright idea of, I found a random USB stick, I'll use it today without thinking, I wonder what's on it. And then they stick it in their computer, and now their computer is locked. We also want to bring up the issue of cryptocurrency, and we would argue that in and of itself, it's not a driving force exactly. It's certainly part of the larger picture, to be clear about this, but it's more like adding fuel to the fire rather than what causes it in the first place. A lot of the current hacker groups are very much state-funded and very much operating with the intentions of disrupting other countries' ability to function in many respects. The fact they get paid for on top of that is more of a bonus than an actual primary goal. Going on to Season 9, we again hope for an improvement in quality and remained dismally disappointed, as anybody who deals with the British would be. Episode 7 is on data brokers.
Moving on, our main story tonight concerns computers. There's one in my house, one in my pocket, and one on my wrist. And fun fact, if they all broke at the same time, I'd die. More specifically, we're going to talk about the fact that we've all had unsettling moments when it became clear that our computer was monitoring our activities a little more closely than we might like. But we have all found ourselves being targeted by ads for something oddly specific and thought, how on earth did they know to show me that? And tonight, we're going to talk about who makes that possible. Data brokers.
Weirdly, we only have one major problem with this, which is unexpected. This is only partially true, as what we need to talk about is people have already known about companies doing this, and companies like Facebook have been forced to admit, after things like the Cambridge Analytica scandal, that many of their applications do listen in on you. The Messenger app, for example, does and did listen into you. Staff did and has continued to listen into you. And this is not a passive effort. Many of these things all contribute to the targeted advertising. The cookies and tracking are also another major part of it. But without pointing out that it's not just that, and certainly that even without the cookies, there are still ample other ways to do what's being done, it's an incomplete picture. Episode 14 is on tech monopolies.
Specifically, we're going to talk about the fact that our experiences on the internet are now dominated by a very small handful of companies who are getting pretty used to throwing their weight around.
And the problem is less that there is an explicit error, so much as the topic moves very quickly, and has moved very quickly, and is very much not accurately portrayed. The changes and movements were happening even when the episode aired, so it was preemptory, and ironically so, for Oliver to choose this topic when it was very soon after changed so drastically. The court cases and various laws that were coming into effect weren't subtly implemented, there was no hiding, there was no covert activity. They were very open and very public, and therefore changes were coming. The problem with this is not unique to apps based on sales or transactions either. As shown with, say, recently China Uncensored, the approval of apps is highly contingent on an arbitrary and capricious metric. Oftentimes, an app will only be approved if it's the most banal and benign of possible apps, or after there is a demonstrated degree of pressure forcing someone like Apple or Google to put it on their various application stores. It's also very much not accurate to say this after the multiple lawsuits, court decisions, and even laws in the European Union that have forced that to happen. Last, we have episode 21 about carbon offsets.
The main story tonight concerns Earth. It's basically the Oscar Isaac of planets, in that it seems to be getting alarmingly hotter every year. Luckily, though, one group is here to fix it: giant corporations. Many are now claiming that they've hit upon a solution, becoming carbon neutral or net zero, basically running their businesses in such a way that they don't increase the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. As of last year, 1 in 5 of the world's 2,000 largest publicly listed companies have now committed to a net zero emissions target, which sounds great. You may even have seen them bragging about their claim. But the key phrasing comes at the end there, that they'd offset any remaining carbon. That's actually a common tactic.
The biggest error we found with this episode regards where and how they are employed at a national level, specifically China. Oliver calls out China as a country that employs carbon offsets and how they're used, and if not necessarily says that they're doing a good job, then doesn't identify their gross failures, which is a problem. China lacks a specific national climate law, and they rely very much on soft regulations and executive orders with practically no legal weight behind them. This means that the very powerless authorities that are meant to make this happen have no ability to enforce it. This leads to market disputes and practically no compliance oversight. Even if there is an attempt at local enforcement, it varies a lot, with some provinces protecting polluting firms, such as coal power plants, to maintain their profitability and ensure there is energy available. And of course there are issues like green credit policies that are linked to these offsets. Oliver literally describes all of these problems, and yet he had a perfect working example in the form of China that he raised earlier on in the same episode, showing that they were doing this, but not that they were doing it badly. The irony is somehow lost here. Season 10, Episode 7 opens with homeowners associations.
The main story tonight concerns home ownership. So if you are under 35, honestly, this story isn't for you. Okay. For everyone who remains, this story is about HOAs, which stands for Homeowners Associations, also sometimes known as community associations.
And we do have an actual clear factual error here, for once. Strictly speaking, a homeowners association is a subset of community associations, whereas a community association is not a homeowners association. The two, as much as it may be a pedantic thing to say, are legally distinct, and Oliver gets this wrong. In terminology, in practice, at least, a community association is used as a catch-all term by all organizations, and this means you can cover a whole bunch of things, whether it's condos, co-ops, communities, or anything else. Whereas the intention is to emphasize a shared community goal, and their legal structure can have a HOA, but not necessarily so. Both of these manage common areas, so for example, waste collection, enforcing of rules, and so on. And what's often going to distinguish them is the kind of property, and to a certain extent the significance of various laws regarding the difference in governance that they can actually apply. And of course the issues around, say, legal issues, and particularly legal challenges regarding the board authority. Is this also a pedantic point? Yes. Should it have been picked up by a pedant like Oliver? Yes. Is it valid? Yes. Is it MasterCard levels of priceless? No. Episode 14 is about McKinsey and Company.
It concerns business, a word that somehow describes the front part of a mullet, the second nicest seat on an airplane, and the single saddest room in any hotel. Specifically, we're going to talk about the businesses that make other businesses' business their business. Management consultants. There are three big firms, and tonight we're going to focus on the oldest and largest one, McKinsey and Company. And look, McKinsey will claim that all the examples I've given you tonight are just isolated cases, not representative of their work overall. What's more, they'll say that they've revamped their policies on client selection and that if a client or proposed project falls short of our standards, we will not do the work. Although they are still working in Saudi Arabia, so their standards seem at best fucking flexible. They also want me to tell you that they do a lot of projects like helping clients deploy vaccines or supporting refugees and rebuilding it in Ukraine, which is very nice. But think of it like this. How many uplifting McKinsey projects like More Snuggles at the Puppy Factory or Make Grandma Live Forever would you need to hear about to effectively counterbalance, turbocharge the opioid epidemic, help fuck up Rikers even more, and make a Saudi Arabian snitch list? And look,
a group that undeniably has done some harm in many ways, in fact, done a lot of harm in many ways, but it also does have some direct rebuttals to what Oliver has claimed. Unavoidable factual rebuttals. Now, do these make up for all of their evil? No, not by a long shot. But stating all the negative things here and not pointing out that they have actually done certain things is a very incomplete picture and could arguably be seen as misrepresenting what's going on. One of the major things they've done, and this may or may not be why they weren't particularly raised as points by Oliver, is that McKinsey was a driving force in increasing DEI, that's diversity, equity, and inclusion in workplaces. There's a 2023 report by McKinsey on why diversity matters even more, the case for holistic impact, what they did was analyze companies and countries, and found that the more gender and ethnically diverse the executive team was, the better it was as a company in terms of performance. This meant that they were strongly advocating for more, let's say, diversity and, equity in leadership roles and providing actionable strategies. There's also the Institute for Black Economic Mobility, which was launched in 2020 and is funded with the intention of inclusive growth and racial equity. No shit with a name like that. So yes, they have actually done some things that are good. As mentioned, some good things, but a whole lot of shit things. A lot of shit things. Last is episode 21 on Elon Musk, and most of this is tantamount to gossip.
We're going to dive straight in with our main story tonight. This is our final show of the year, so we thought we'd focus on someone who's had a pretty big 12 months, Elon Musk.
But a few points do need to be stated, as Oliver failed to provide the requisite information that should have been there. First, we have the boycott. This did lead to a substantial decline in X's advertising revenue, and historically it's supposed to have accounted for up to 90% of the platform's income, although it can be as low as 70%. There are estimates that suggest that Elon's actions led to a loss of up to $75 million in ad revenue in 2023. Now, this is estimated, again, to be a decrease of between 50 and 60%. That's a lot. It's thought that pre-acquisition, that's when it was going by Twitter, it was worth between $4 and $5 million in year-on-year revenue. This dropped down to between 2 and 2.5 in 2023. Again, this does operate very much on a lot of inferential information, mostly because it's a private company. This also follows other public statements by various officers within X now, which said that by 2025, 90% of those same advertisers who had boycotted X had returned. And it does admittedly lack a degree of detail, let's call it, and some other sources do try to contradict this, but to an extent we would argue that it's rather hard to say that they know better than the CEOs within X, but at the same time, how much X actually says is the truth is up for debate. And finally, we know now that, the subscription growth has considerably added to the revenue of X, and with the return of advertisers, it's currently estimated that between 70 and 75% of total revenue has come back. Although, again, this does rely more heavily on subscription things to, say, having a check mark. Finally, we have to point out that, unlike Ford, Musk has yet to provide all the profit from Tesla sales in Europe, or another geographically discrete area, to an extremist political party to help in the genociding of a particular group. So, some differences are definitely worth pointing out. And of course, NASA is public, and obviously is, whereas SpaceX is private, and, as Oliver has said previously, they can basically do what they want with their services and so on, as long as it isn't discriminatory and so on. In other words, Musk can blow up as much of his money as he wants with giant rockets, and it's something that Oliver has repeatedly trumpeted in the past. Admittedly, often in the form of spending money wildly on novelty and gags for the very show we're talking about. We also need to talk about the Tesla Cybertruck and the window shattering. The response to this, when it happened at the time, was a oh shit moment by Musk, obviously, but also analysis afterwards found that there was a degree of unseen damage that had compromised the window's structural integrity, given the fact it had basically been hit with a sledgehammer earlier in the day. This is not to say that that is the actual cause, but there is a good argument being made that the subsequently thrown wall is what broke the window because of damage caused by that minor failure in its structural integrity. Now, this is not necessarily true, but it does appear to be at least a reasonable answer as to what's going on here. Of course, this again depends a lot on other variables. For example, whether or not we're talking about, say, was the testing of the window originally based on purely static forces, or was it under what is tantamount to laboratory conditions, and so on. So it is entirely possible that under the essentially wild conditions of this display that it just didn't cope. But that's a big issue in what we're talking about here. There are some serious questions about what's going on, and there's even more problems when you look at the actual mounting differences, let's call them. The pre-event testing was done using clamps, and obviously clamps will have some flex in them. They're meant to. The Cybertruck's window is meant to be rigid when in situ, and this means it can more easily crack, which again isn't brought up by Oliver. And of course we do have anecdotal evidence from journalists and so on, which, depending on what you want to take these as, could be considered a degree of, let's say, gossip as well. But in terms of pure gossip, we do have the issues around X, formerly Twitter, and as much as Oliver wants to dismiss Taibbi's work and the Twitter files, they are reasonably clear-cut. They do point out that there are issues around decreasing engagement for things that are controversial. This can be considered shadowbanning. Whether you want to use that term or not is relatively indifferent. But the anecdotal evidence and later the investigations into this show that it appears to not only be widespread, but it is fairly clear, and the results are fairly definitive. This is all based on internal Twitter documentation. Internal documents from before the acquisition. So it's much clearer to say that there was definitely visibility filtering, which is shadow banning, and this would reduce the reach of certain accounts without notifying the users or the account holder. So yes, it was confirmation of visibility filtering targeting certain accounts that the Twitter at the time considered controversial. Last, we have Season 11 and Episode 7 to start with about executions.
We're going to dive straight into our main story tonight, which concerns the death penalty. America's had it for centuries, but its methods have varied considerably, as this documentary from the 80s explains in weirdly comprehensive fashion.
The methods America has used to execute its criminals have changed over the years, from burning to drawing and quartering to hanging. Criminals have been axed, crucified, buried alive, pressed with weights, stoned, impaled, starved, decapitated, and gibbeted. Gibbeting is the hanging of the condemned man by chains to rot. Death often takes weeks to occur.
Oliver gets some things wrong here in very specific ways. First of all, people would die from suffocation before exposure when gibbeted as described. If actual gibbeting as it's defined was used, exposure would kill first. You technically wouldn't rot to death. And per a recent US court ruling, nitrogen gas isn't toxic apparently. It's a nonsense decision, but that was the decision. Of course, we do have gases such as nitrogen, but much more frequently they use things like carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide, as these are almost the only universally recognized means of euthanizing animals, and you may not like it, but humans are animals. This leads to issues around very much the selective frame of execution methods, and the overemphasis on certain cases where execution methods failed, and caused unreasonable and unnecessary suffering, which, yeah, that is entirely terrible. But there are recognized methods usable. For example, most animal rights organizations that are at least modestly sane, so we can exclude PETA off the bat there, will not count things like carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide as unnecessarily cruel. In fact, they often consider them a relatively, not necessarily kind, but not a suffering way for an animal to die. And of course, there is a gross oversimplification of the justice system, which, given the duration of his show, kind of makes sense. Episode 14 builds on the errors that we've identified, although very limited errors as most of the problem solutions and events are.
This story is going to be less about marine life in the deep ocean and more about what else is down there with them. Specifically, that the ocean floor is full of deposits of critical minerals. Some are in the crusts of underwater mountains or around hydrothermal vents, and some, the ones we'll be focusing on tonight, take the form of potato-shaped nodules, little lumpy spheres formed over millions of years. Basically, a nucleus, like a little bit of bone or sand, slowly accrued a build-up of metals at a rate of around 1 millimetre every million years or so. Those nodules now line some parts of the deep ocean floor and contain valuable metals like nickel and cobalt, which can be used for things like batteries for electric cars. So obviously, people are very interested in getting their hands on them.
Currently hypothetical if there is a possible error that we think there might be, or that, well, let's just say there's a lot of hypotheticals going on here, other than the very specific following issue. The probability of a drug not being discovered is practically non-existent, but even if the drugs that were discovered can be traced back to the deep-sea mining area nodules, the drug itself that you see that is going on to cause things to be cured are drastically transformed and different from what you would find in the wild. This is like looking at a car from the start of the 20th century and a modern electric car and claiming they are the same. They're not. The iterative processes to develop one thing from the other are huge, and the complexities of getting from start to finish arbitrary finish, are huge. Of course, this isn't to say that it's not useful to have a greater source of biodiversity and therefore possibly a greater ability to bioprospect new compounds, but pedantry is demonstrated about fact-checking already, and Oliver has already stated that he is a pedant, so he should at least appreciate this. Last is episode 21 from season 11, and the problem we have is very simple.
Hospice. And I realised that doing an episode about hospice is an almost offensive parody of this show. If somebody else did that, it would genuinely be hurtful. But I promise this is worth talking about.
The only noteworthy issue we found is that working at Walmart is like death, only worse.
What was called an atlas of human suffering.
You are in hell, the people there are somehow worse than you can imagine, and might as well be Lucifer incarnate, and there is no escape, ever, unlike most typical hells which are generally considered to have you suffer for a time until you've repented for your sins, or whatever else you happen to have done. You can never escape Walmart. All of what we've mentioned so far is not to say that no effort is made in being accurate or fixing errors. The problem is that any errors that get fixed are relatively minor compared to some of the more gross errors that are made, have been made, and probably will continue to be made. In a 2018 segment, Oliver humorously had issued a retraction, but these were again minor errors acknowledging mistakes like misidentifying a location, exaggerating certain things, and, well, it does suggest that there is an awareness of inaccuracies. And major errors appear to be less frequently, if at all, ever addressed. This is the problem. Small mistakes that are admitted with surprising candor by most people. Large mistakes tend to be ignored, and this is true of Oliver. We would honestly expect it to be something the other way around. Deal with the big problems and ignore the small stuff. It's like ego may play a role in this, that it is harder to admit your big failures, but easier to admit small mistakes. But it's the big failures that are going to most significantly affect his credibility and lead to the more significant implications for things that relate to, say, issues like this not being taken seriously or being addressed in the completely wrong way. To use a crude example of our own, we are happy to admit failures with regards to misspelling the shorthand for ethanol, but find it harder to admit outright errors, although thankfully we don't think we've made too many of those so far. And what errors we have made, we generally try and correct if we can, but then again, we don't have $1 million per video studio, staff, and everything else either, so take that how you will.
Yes, oh omnipresent authority figure.
To bring this all back to the start of the video, there is a lot of money, time, and effort thrown into these episodes, enough that they can buy giant squirrel costumes, huge amounts of medical debt, cameo Sesame Street characters, and so on. Yet, as we have identified, there is not enough time, effort, or money put into getting this right at times, and in fairly significant ways can they get it wrong. Now, are some of these issues, say, more nuanced than we presented them? Yeah, sure. But we've also condensed down what is effectively the equivalent of somewhere in the ballpark of 7 to 8 hours of video into a 30-ish minute video of our own. So no, we can't provide the same level of depth, but we're also, again, not funded the same way, aren't staffed the same way, aren't resourced the same way, and we don't have a giant sugar daddy in the form of HBO footing the bill for any sort of lawsuits and other things we might face. So we have to be at least somewhat light with our criticisms, no matter how horrendous the bullshit may be. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, and please do post your comments, questions, or suggestions below.